by Irina Shklovski from IT University of Copenhagen.
Thanks. Hi, this is a really intimidating room, and the light's right in my eyes, so if I'm squinting, you know why. I actually can't see you guys. It's really weird. There's like blinking in my eyes because of the light. Anyway, so I'm here to talk to you today about IoT Manifestos. And the title of my talk is Calling for a Revolution. This is work done with Ester Fritsch and Rachel Douglas-Jones. This is part of a bigger project, so I'm going to start a little bit first telling you about the project and where it came from. The very idea of the project is that there are smart devices everywhere. And smart devices are invading our spaces and invading some of the more intimate ones as well. And they're difficult at times to navigate. This XKCD cartoon does that quite well. And we argue that the problem is that for the IoT devices to invade spaces, what happens is that the flows of data decisions become less visible to the user. And that in turn means that the onus of moral reasoning shifts further on the developers. How do you engage the users in ways that respect them and treat them with dignity? Because these devices assume and require increasing amounts of trust without actually being visible. So our project, Virtue, is Values and Ethics in Responsible Technologies in Europe. And our goal, primary goal, is to develop a framework to help designers and developers of IoT devices to think in terms of ethical and moral decisions. And as part of that, we have been mapping how ethics is practiced among European designers and developers of the Internet of Things and IT technologies. And what we found in the first year of the project, there was something somewhat surprising. There are a lot of manifestos. And although many manifestos are written in 2011 or 2012, recently the number of manifestos has been increasing. And so as you can see here, for each year we have more and more manifestos being written. We started wondering, what are these documents? They're mostly written by developers and designers, activists, thinkers, the communities of developers. All of these come from Europe, and our question was, what are they trying to tell us, how, and why now? And the reason is that manifestos are a particular kind of genre. They are calls for a revolution. They are loud documents, they emerge in response to a moment of crisis, and they define it. They point out wrongness. It's a sense of wrongness that leads to manifestos typically, and they need to take a clear stand. Manifestos mince no words. These are genres of plain speech, but they link their voices to prior struggles. These are about revolutions. So for us, the proliferation of manifestos in response to technology development clearly said something is not right, at least in Europe, for designers and developers of IoT. And the question for us then was, what is it that they're against? And what is it that they're calling for? So what we did was we collected 28 documents that were published between 2011 and 2017. 8 of these name themselves manifestos directly. 24 address IoT development directly and specifically, 4 are a little bit more about technology development more broadly. And we had some specific criteria for inclusion. These needed to be documents that were either self-declared manifestos or that were part of an advocacy effort towards responsible technologies of some sort. They either identified a crisis or forcefully called for change, or both. They produced frameworks for good technologies that were done responsibly, or, as in one case, they were an essay collection that was a clear response to a moment of crisis and was really put together to call for change. So what is it that these manifestos are doing? They're defining historical moments and paradigm shifts, typically. So the proliferation of these documents now indicates a moment of crisis. This is the era of IoT, and it's full of dark threats and apocalyptic narratives. There's anxiety about the futures our current technology trajectories spell out. But these trajectories are actually clearly connected to the past and to very familiar HCI tropes, specifically to ubiquitous computing. Concerned as it was at the time, with ubiquity and invisibility, these values are actually quite central to the kinds of concerns that manifestos discuss. So we organized our paper and this presentation around the discussion of the kinds of values that emerged from our analysis of manifestos. These values are many, but the specific ones that we want to focus here are ubiquity and invisibility, which turn out to be far less positive than originally envisioned. Transparency as a potential solution. Openness is one of the biggest and overarching underlying values of these manifestos. Sustainability in very different ways. All of it leading to discussions of responsibility. Who is responsible and what is responsible? Across all of these discussions, we saw concerns for privacy and control. I don't have time to go through those here today, but they are clearly discussed in the paper. Let's start with ubiquity and invisibility. There were a few manifestos that clearly called for ubiquity and invisibility as clear values that were important to achieve, clearly echoing Weiser's calls. But many, many more argued against it. Here, the top design studio's Riot Responsible IoT Manifesto actually calls ubiquity and invisibility manipulative and argues that it needs to be addressed. And they propose transparency as a solution. Top here talks about that transparency is something that needs to happen, and then asks, is it clear when your product uses its sensors, and how does it process data? The State of Responsible Internet of Things document also talks about transparency. And it's literally talking about we need to mold our perception of the world. And so making technologies not transparent is clearly a political decision. Transparency is key. And when things are not transparent, what we're doing is manipulating. An attendant and very strong and positive value is openness. Openness seemed to be unassailable. It was an answer to all ills. But openness had a bit of a paradox embedded in it. The idea was that openness could combat surveillance. It could democratize ownership and control, decentralize power, strengthen inclusion and accessibility, and really address all the world's ills. But the question is, what are the benefits of getting it right, and for whom? Because it can never be everyone. There is a paradox to openness, is that it is never possible to include everyone. There's always a choice. But the rhetoric of openness, while positive, does not actually allow a discussion of exclusion, even as it structures their very definition, by its very definition, exclude those who disagree with this idea. So openness actually is exclusionary in particular ways, but as long as openness is lauded as the main goal and value, it is impossible to discuss its problems. Another very strong value that was discussed a lot was sustainability. Surprisingly, very few manifestos expressed concerns about environmental sustainability. Instead, most of the concerns were about how long would these devices function. After all, when was the last time you bought a piece of software and expected it to still work a year later? What about your fridge? You would certainly expect your fridge to work for far longer than a piece of software. Now, what if it is a smart fridge? There's clearly a tension that had to do with the problem of physicality for a software mindset. And the issue was that sustainability has to do with obsolescence. Building for obsolescence is perhaps not such a great deal, a big deal if you're building software. But if you're building physical objects, obsolescence becomes an issue. And so the IoT Design Manifesto claims we design things for their lifetime. It doesn't, however, discuss how long that lifetime must be, but that is clearly a concern. Not everyone is very much concerned with issues of obsolescence, but they see locality and focusing on the local, investing, developing local access, adapting to the precise context within which technologies work, building local communities and their capabilities as potential solutions to managing this problem. Reuse, reusability, modularity were big issues. And finally, we come to responsibility. Calls to responsibility pervade contemporary life. These often indicate a lack or an aspiration. We want to be responsible. Something is wrong and responsibility is necessary. Somebody, somewhere, needs to take responsibility for something. The manifesto authors put forward different understandings of responsibility, and we detail these in the paper. There was a difference also between asking who is responsible for our collective futures and what is responsible. What is a responsible action or technology? And some manifestos focused on one, some on the other. We identify three different ways that responsibility is understood or discussed. First is understanding. The understandability of IoT devices, of their design, data management, and potential consequences of their use is seen as a significant problem. So here we see there's a need for necessary training of citizens so that informed ethical and political discussion can take place. The majority of the documents, however, focus less on citizens needing to be educated, but on the responsibility of designers to make their products understandable. Shifting the emphasis from the relationship between the designers and users, there are also calls explicitly oriented towards designers and developers. So manifestos create their publics, and in orienting towards designers and developers, what they do is they create a we. We, the designers, and we, the developers, have the responsibility to act. Design is an impactful act. This all-encompassing we then addresses a whole community, creates a community. And while some are clear about what responsibility in the development of IoT might look like, by and large, most manifestos are actually interested in having a dialogue about what responsibility itself means. Responsible design then must be more than just adding technology. Manifestos invite readers to dialogue and debate. Read with an eye to the location of responsibility, here there is a tension in this distribution. While responsibility is placed upon the we of designers, there is simultaneously a desire that in taking responsibility for design, designers have designed in responsibilities for the users. So responsibility is something all manifesto authors call for. There's actually little agreement about the nature of that responsibility, the subjects or groups that take it on, or the ends that it has in sight. And so we come to a crossroads of a common future, and that is what manifestos point to. They point to a crossroads. They say now, right now, we need to decide. We either turn left or right, and on one side there is peril. Manifestos aim to shift the tone of address. They want to talk about the future, but they also lay out each their own version of a hyped present, followed by an anxious, dark future, while reminding users that future is not set, and that it is their responsibility to act in changing it. They appear in moments of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and assert certainty in the face of it. And manifestos rally supporters to create a we, where at stake is a common future. But what we see here is something else. When discussing responsibility, there is an attention to inclusion and distribution within the calls of responsibility. But often it can result in what we call responsibilisation. This is a concept that refers to how individuals in neoliberal states are under pressure to formulate themselves as independent, self-managing, and self-empowered subjects. While the manifesto authors raise critique of dominant forces driving the development of IoT solutions, most authors place responsibility for action in the daily practice of designers and developers, down in the trenches where responsibility lies. No manifestos call explicitly for political or judicial reconfigurations. This is not politics in a politics sense. This is a personal politics, a kind of virtue ethics. They emphasize the idealized, autonomous subject enmeshed in these interdependencies and responsibilities, and that's where they assign these. IoT then is a matter of care for practitioner communities about the choice made in designing. It is not clear whether that responsibility ought to be placed entirely on the designers and developers, but they're certainly calling for it. And in some ways, that indicates not everything is right. So I want to thank all of the manifesto authors. They're all listed in our paper, and ask for questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kristen Williams. I'm from Carnegie Mellon. First, I'd just like to thank you for your talk. It was quite lovely. But my question to you, so you end with this characterization of responsibility, adopting a kind of virtue ethic framework where it's ethics as an embedded practice. And my question for you is, given the complexity that we know technological development is, if ethics is embedded practice by developers and designers, how does that fit within a larger ecosystem that includes business managers, economic forces about how technology is disseminated and distributed, policymakers who, interrogate how that technology is living up to how current policy is set? My question is, do you really think this virtue ethic framework can get at some of these more complex ecosystem questions about whether we're going to get the kind of emergent ethical outcome we might hope for?
Well, the first answer is no, I don't, actually. The interesting thing with the virtue ethics framework is what it allows us to do is to look at how ethics is enacted. It allows us, and it gives us a framework to think about how ethics, what is ethics in practice and what does that look like? But it doesn't allow us to think about what are some of the answers and what are some of the solutions. Because in the end, virtue ethics as a framework is fundamentally individualized, where clearly individual responsibility doesn't work. It works it doesn't work entirely to answer to these really big pressures and big questions. So in that sense, as a project, actually, we initially had a very well-developed virtue ethics framework, and then we realized it won't work. And it won't work because you need more than one ethical framework to put together to understand the whole ecosystem of how things function and what needs to happen. But in looking at the manifestos themselves, what we see is, in fact, this enactment of ethics, which I think is an important step to understanding how might we go about then solving some of the problems we're facing.
Thank you.
Hi, Dave Miller from Stanford. If the manifesto authors are going about this, what you say is the wrong way, then what is the correct thing to do, or even a correct direction to move us in a more positive way in terms of policy, in terms of design, in terms of any of these interlocking issues?
I don't at all say that they're going about this in the wrong way. In fact, I'm going to try not to fall off. In fact, I actually think that it is fantastic. It is amazing that we're seeing this, and it is indicative of the problems and the kinds of anxieties that a lot of these manifesto authors are expressing. And it is indicative that not all is well. The technology and the promises that have been made early on with technological futures are now being questioned by the very people that are designing these futures, and that's amazing. At the same time, what we're seeing is to some extent a failure of imagination, because the solutions go back to some of the same problematic notions. And that is why, our effort is to try and figure out what are some of the other suggestions you can make, some of the other routes you can point to. But there are no easy answers, and I don't think they're doing it wrong.